What would you do if your wife announced a sudden work trip with her boss, but you discovered her boss wasn't traveling at all, and the man she was really with controlled the vendor contracts that funded her department? Would you confront her, or would you let her walk into a trap? My name is Flynn Hartley, and I work in crisis public relations, which means I spend my professional life reading deception in press releases and coaching executives on how to control narratives when their companies are caught in scandals that threaten to destroy reputations built over decades. The irony of discovering that my own wife had been constructing an elaborate deception right under my nose was not lost on me, though at the moment when she first announced her sudden work trip over breakfast on a Tuesday morning in late March, I did not yet understand the full scope of what she was planning or how carefully she had prepared the ground for what would turn out to be a betrayal that involved not just emotional infidelity, but a transactional relationship with professional implications that extended far beyond our marriage. Lydia stood at the kitchen counter, pouring her second cup of coffee when she mentioned almost casually that she would be traveling for 3 days starting Thursday for a vendor conference that her boss Diana had organized. And she said this in the same tone she might use to mention picking up groceries or scheduling a dentist appointment, as though a sudden multi-day business trip announced with less than 48 hours notice was a perfectly normal occurrence that required no particular explanation or advance coordination. Lydia stood at the kitchen counter, pouring her second cup of coffee when she mentioned almost casually that she would be traveling for 3 days starting Thursday for a vendor conference that her boss Diana had organized, and she said this in the same tone she might use to mention picking up groceries or scheduling a dentist appointment, as though a sudden multi-day business trip announced with less than 48 hours notice was a perfectly normal occurrence that required no particular explanation or advance coordination. I looked up from the quarterly earnings report I had been reviewing on my tablet and asked which vendors would be attending and what city the conference was being held in. And I watched Lydia's eyes shift slightly to the left as she answered that Diana was handling all the logistics and that she did not have the full itinerary yet, but would forward me the details once Diana's assistant sent them over. The eye movement was subtle enough that most people would not have registered it as significant, but I have spent 15 years training myself to read micro-expressions and body language tells that indicate when someone is constructing a response rather than recalling information. And the leftward eye shift, combined with the vague reference to Diana handling logistics, struck me as the kind of deflection that people use when they are buying time to create a plausible story rather than simply answering a straightforward question. I did not challenge her response in the moment because I have learned through my work that premature confrontation simply gives the deceptive party time to refine their cover story and shore up any gaps in their narrative. And I made a mental note to verify the conference details independently once Lydia left for her office at the hospital foundation, where she worked as a compliance officer responsible for ensuring that vendor relationships and contract approvals followed proper ethical guidelines and conflict of interest policies. After Lydia gathered her briefcase and left for work, I sent her a casual text message asking her to forward me the hotel name and conference schedule when she had a chance, framing the request as a safety concern so that I would know where to reach her in case of emergency, and she replied about 20 minutes later saying that Diana's assistant was still finalizing the booking but that she would send everything over as soon as she had it. I screenshot her text message and saved it in a new folder on my phone that I labeled simply with the current date. And then I opened our shared family calendar application that Lydia and I both use to coordinate schedules and track travel plans and medical appointments and social commitments, and I looked at the Thursday through Saturday time block that Lydia had marked with an away status, indicating she would be out of the office and unavailable during those days. What caught my attention immediately was that Diana Foster, Lydia's boss at the hospital foundation, also had those exact same 3 days marked as away on the shared calendar that the foundation staff apparently used to coordinate schedules and plan meetings. And I could see Diana's calendar because Lydia had given me view access to her work schedule months earlier so that I could plan around her professional commitments when we were coordinating personal travel or social events. If Diana was also traveling during those same 3 days, then it made sense that she and Lydia would both be attending the same vendor conference. But something about the coinciding schedules felt off in a way that I could not immediately articulate beyond a general sense that the timing was too neat and the details too vague for what should have been a straightforward business trip that would have been planned and communicated well in advance, rather than announced with less than 2 days' notice. I spent the next 30 minutes searching online for vendor conferences scheduled for the following Thursday through Saturday that would be relevant to hospital foundation compliance work, checking industry association websites and event calendar listings for healthcare philanthropy and nonprofit management sectors, and I found exactly 0 conferences matching the timing and subject matter that Lydia had described. I expanded my search to include conferences in neighboring states and broader topics related to vendor management and contract compliance, and still found nothing that would explain why Lydia and Diana would both be traveling on such short notice to an event that apparently left no digital footprint in the form of registration pages or promotional materials or speaker schedules. The absence of any discoverable conference information was not conclusive evidence of deception on its own, because it was theoretically possible that this was a small private gathering organized by a specific vendor or a closed-door session for select foundation personnel. But my professional instincts told me that the vagueness and the rushed timing and the lack of advanced planning all pointed toward a cover story rather than a legitimate business trip. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to Diana Foster's public social media profiles, which she maintained with moderate activity for professional networking purposes, and I scrolled through her recent posts looking for any mention of upcoming travel or conference attendance. And what I found was a post from 3 days earlier where Diana had mentioned looking forward to a staycation week with plans to catch up on reading and home projects and explore some new restaurants in the neighborhood. The staycation post was dated Monday, which meant that as of 3 days ago, Diana had been planning to stay home during the exact same Thursday through Saturday window that she and Lydia now supposedly had marked for out-of-town travel to a vendor conference. And the contradiction between Diana's stated personal plans and the work trip that Lydia claimed they were taking together was significant enough that I screenshot the social media post and saved it to my evidence folder alongside Lydia's text message and the shared calendar image. I considered calling Diana directly to ask about the conference details, but I decided that premature contact might alert Lydia if Diana mentioned my inquiry, and I wanted to gather more information before revealing that I was actively investigating the trip rather than passively accepting Lydia's explanation. I returned to our shared credit card account and logged into the online portal to review recent charges and pending transactions, and I scrolled through the list of merchants and amounts looking for anything that might indicate travel bookings or conference registrations or hotel reservations that would correspond with the trip Lydia had announced. The account showed routine charges for groceries and gas and subscription services, and nothing that suggested upcoming travel, but I noticed that the pending transactions section at the top of the page displayed one new charge that had posted within the past hour, and when I clicked on the transaction details, I saw that it was for a luxury resort suite upgrade totaling $647, and the merchant name included a resort property in a coastal city about 3 hours away. And most significantly, the billing name on the charge was listed as M. Caldwell, rather than Lydia's name or my name as the primary cardholders. I stared at the screen trying to make sense of why a charge under someone else's name would appear on our shared account, and the only logical explanation was that Lydia had provided our credit card number to another person who had used it to book or upgrade a hotel reservation for the upcoming trip. And the fact that this person was apparently named M. Caldwell rather than Diana Foster raised immediate questions about who Lydia was actually traveling with and whether Diana was involved at all, or whether Lydia had simply used her boss's name as convenient cover for a trip that involved someone else entirely. I screenshot the credit card transaction page with the $647 charge and the M. Caldwell billing name clearly visible, and I added the image to my evidence folder with a note about the timestamp and the fact that the charge had posted approximately 30 minutes after Lydia had left for work this morning. A secretary answered, and I asked to speak with Diana Foster, and the secretary asked if I wanted to leave a message since Diana was at her desk but currently in a meeting. And I said that I would try back later, but could the secretary confirm whether Diana would be in the office later this week or if she had travel planned? The secretary said without hesitation that Diana would be in the office all week and that she had a full schedule of meetings and editorial reviews planned. And I thanked her and ended the call and sat staring at my phone while the implications of what I had just learned settled into place with the weight of confirmed deception rather than mere suspicion. The confirmation from Diana's secretary that she would be in the office all week and had no travel planned meant that Lydia had deliberately constructed a false narrative using her boss's name as cover for a trip that Diana knew nothing about. And the lie was not a spontaneous invention or a misunderstanding, but rather a calculated deception that required advanced planning and the coordination of calendar entries and cover stories designed to prevent me from asking questions or seeking verification. I sat in my home office for several minutes processing the implications of what I had discovered and thinking through the strategic options available to me. And I recognized that I was now operating with information that Lydia believed was still hidden, which gave me a tactical advantage that I could leverage either through immediate confrontation or through continued investigation that would allow me to gather more comprehensive evidence before revealing what I knew. I replied to her text saying that I had not received anything yet, but that there was no rush and she should just send it whenever she had it. And I deliberately kept my tone casual and unconcerned so that she would not sense any suspicion or unusual interest in the trip details. Lydia's text message follow-up suggested that she was aware of the need to maintain her cover story and to provide at least some minimal details that would satisfy any reasonable questions I might have about where she was going and what she would be doing during her 3 days away. And I wondered whether she would eventually send me fabricated hotel information or whether she would claim that Diana's assistant had still not finalized the arrangements and that she would just text me the details once she arrived at her destination. The fact that she was actively managing the cover story rather than simply hoping I would not ask questions indicated a level of calculation and advanced planning that went beyond spontaneous deception. And I made a note in my timeline document about the follow-up text and about Lydia's apparent concern with maintaining the appearance of normal business travel coordination. I decided that rather than waiting for Lydia to provide false information that I would then need to verify or challenge, I would take a more direct approach by contacting Diana Foster myself and asking her about the trip in a way that would force clarification about whether she was actually involved or whether Lydia had been using her name without authorization. I composed a text message to Diana's cell phone number, which I had saved in my contacts from previous social interactions when Lydia and I had attended hospital foundation events where Diana was present as a senior staff member, and I wrote a brief message saying that I needed to discuss Lydia's upcoming trip and asking if Diana would be available to meet for coffee sometime in the next day or two before Lydia departed on Thursday. I sent the text message to Diana and then waited to see how she would respond, and I recognized that her reaction would tell me a great deal about whether she was aware of Lydia's plans and was either complicit in the deception or at least knowledgeable about what was happening, or whether she would be confused by my message because she had no idea what trip I was referring to and had not authorized the use of her name as cover for whatever Lydia was actually planning. My phone buzzed less than 5 minutes later with Diana's response, and when I opened the message, I saw that she had written back with obvious concern, asking what trip I was talking about, because she was not traveling anywhere this week, and she had not organized any vendor conference or offsite meetings that would involve Lydia being away from the office for multiple days. Diana's response confirmed that she had no knowledge of the trip and had not been involved in planning or authorizing any travel for Lydia, which meant that Lydia had fabricated the entire story and had used Diana's name and position without permission in order to create a plausible cover for what was actually a personal trip with Richard Caldwell that had nothing to do with hospital foundation business or legitimate work obligations. I appreciated Diana's careful attention to legal and ethical boundaries, even as we were planning a strategy that would involve exposing our spouse's affair in a very public and professionally damaging context. And I told her that I agreed we should limit our evidence gathering to information that we could access through legitimate means without resorting to hacking or surveillance or any tactics that could be characterized as harassment or invasion of privacy beyond what was reasonable for spouses who had discovered deception and were trying to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from them. Diana nodded and said that she thought we had enough evidence already to justify filing complaints with the hospital's Human Resources Department about potential conflicts of interest, but that she wanted to wait until after we had confirmed the affair was ongoing and had documented the trip before we triggered any formal institutional processes that would alert Richard and Lydia that they were under investigation.
We spent another 20 minutes discussing the timeline for our collaboration and agreeing on what steps each of us would take over the next 2 weeks leading up to the charity gala. And Diana said that she would begin preparing presentation materials for the gala that would include a section on the foundation's commitment to ethical vendor relationships and transparent procurement practices, and that she would create space within that presentation to display specific examples of contract approvals and compliance reviews that would allow her to highlight the connections between Richard's role and Lydia's department without initially revealing the personal relationship that underlay those professional interactions. I suggested to Diana that we should wait until Lydia and Richard actually departed on Thursday before we took any further investigative steps, because I wanted to see if either of them would provide any additional details about their supposed separate business trips that might reveal inconsistencies or create opportunities for us to verify their actual whereabouts and activities during the 3 days they would be away. Diana agreed and said that she would maintain her normal routine at work and at home so that Richard would not suspect that she had discovered his travel plans or that she was coordinating with me to document what he and Lydia were doing together. I spent the evening reviewing the evidence I had compiled and thinking about how Diana and I would present the information at the charity gala in 2 weeks, and I recognized that we would need to structure the revelation carefully so that it appeared to be about institutional accountability and ethical governance rather than personal revenge or emotional retaliation, because the donor audience and the hospital board members would be much more receptive to concerns about conflicts of interest and policy violations than they would be to dramatic accusations of infidelity or betrayal that might seem like private matters that should not be aired in a professional fundraising context. I made notes about the key points we would need to establish through our presentation, including the professional relationship between Richard and Lydia, the vendor contracts that Richard had approved benefiting Lydia's department, the coordinated cover stories they had used to conceal their travel together, and the violation of hospital policies regarding conflicts of interest and appropriate boundaries between personnel in positions of authority over financial decisions and personnel in compliance roles responsible for monitoring those decisions. As I prepared for bed that night, I received one final text message from Lydia saying that she had spoken with Diana's assistant and that the hotel information would be sent to me tomorrow morning before she left for work. And I realized that Lydia was continuing to maintain her cover story and was apparently planning to send me false information about her accommodations and itinerary in order to sustain the deception through the entire duration of her trip. I replied to her message with a brief acknowledgement, and then I lay awake for a long time thinking about the fact that my wife was actively lying to me and constructing elaborate false narratives while simultaneously planning to spend 3 days with another woman's husband at a luxury resort that we were partially paying for through the misuse of our shared financial resources. The next morning, Lydia left for work without mentioning the trip or the hotel information she had promised to send, and I watched her gather her laptop bag and coffee thermos and walk out to her car with the same routine efficiency that she displayed every weekday morning, and there was nothing in her demeanor or her behavior that suggested any awareness that I had discovered her deception or that I was actively investigating her relationship with Richard Caldwell. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway before I opened my laptop and checked my email to see if she had followed through on her promise to send me the fabricated hotel details, and I found a message that had arrived about 20 minutes earlier with the subject line "Trip Info" and an attachment containing what appeared to be a conference hotel located in a city about 4 hours inland from where I knew she and Richard were actually planning to stay at the coastal resort. The fake hotel confirmation was professionally formatted and included realistic details about check-in dates and room type and conference facility amenities. And I recognized that Lydia had put significant effort into creating a plausible document rather than simply sending me a casual text message with vague information, which suggested that she understood the importance of maintaining a detailed and consistent cover story that would withstand basic scrutiny if I happened to call the hotel or look up the property online. I spent Wednesday morning reviewing the Hospital Foundation's public vendor contract database more systematically than I had during my initial investigation, and I created a spreadsheet documenting every contract that Richard had approved over the past 18 months that involved services or products being delivered to Lydia's compliance office or to programs that Lydia had been involved in developing or managing.
The pattern that emerged from this analysis was striking because it showed that Richard had approved a total of 7 contracts worth a combined value of over $200,000 that directly benefited initiatives that Lydia was responsible for, and the approval dates for these contracts were clustered in several distinct periods that corresponded with dates when I could remember Lydia mentioning that she was working late or attending evening meetings or participating in weekend planning sessions that she characterized as routine professional obligations that required her attention and presence. I cross-referenced the contract approval dates with our shared family calendar to see if there were any patterns in Lydia's schedule that might indicate she had been meeting with Richard during the periods when these contracts were being developed and approved, and I found that on at least 4 occasions, Lydia had marked evening time blocks as vendor review meetings or compliance coordination sessions that now appeared to have been cover stories for personal meetings with Richard rather than legitimate work activities involving multiple staff members or formal organizational processes. I screenshot the calendar entries and added them to my evidence folder along with the contract approval records, and I sent Diana a summary of what I had found, along with my assessment that the pattern of coordination between Richard's approvals and Lydia's schedule suggested their relationship had been ongoing for most of the 18 months since Richard had returned to the city and joined the Hospital Foundation's leadership team. Diana responded to my message with information that supported my timeline analysis, saying that Richard had mentioned Lydia's name increasingly often over the past year in the context of describing productive collaborations with Foundation staff members who understood the importance of strategic vendor relationships and efficient procurement processes, and that Diana had initially been pleased that Richard seemed to be building strong working relationships with competent colleagues like Lydia, but had gradually begun to notice that Richard's mentions of Lydia carried a tone of admiration or respect that seemed slightly excessive given the routine nature of the compliance work that Lydia was supposedly helping him coordinate. Diana added that she had dismissed her concerns at the time as jealousy or insecurity because Richard had characterized her questions about Lydia as irrational suspicion of normal professional interactions, and that Richard had been skillful in making Diana feel guilty for even mentioning her discomfort with how often he talked about Lydia or how enthusiastically he praised her contributions to various projects and initiatives. The dynamic that Diana described was familiar to me because Lydia had similarly dismissed any questions I had asked over the past year about her evening meetings or her weekend planning sessions, and she had characterized my interest in the details of her work schedule as controlling behavior or lack of trust in her professional judgment, and she had been effective in making me feel that asking follow-up questions about who else attended these meetings or what specific topics were being discussed would mark me as an insecure spouse who did not respect her independence or her career commitments. I recognize now that both Richard and Lydia had used very similar tactical approaches to shut down questions or concerns from their respective spouses, and that they had probably discussed and refined these deflection strategies together as part of their ongoing coordination around concealing their relationship from the people who are closest to them and most likely to notice inconsistencies or suspicious patterns in their schedules and behaviors. I sent Diana a message suggesting that we should document not just the vendor contracts and the travel deception, but also the pattern of deflection and manipulation that Richard and Lydia had used to prevent us from asking questions or seeking clarification about their activities, because I thought that pattern was itself evidence of calculated deception rather than spontaneous poor judgment or impulsive romantic involvement. Diana agreed and said that she would write a summary of the conversations she could remember where Richard had dismissed her concerns or had made her feel guilty for expressing discomfort with his relationship with Lydia. And she said that she thought this emotional manipulation was actually more damaging in some ways than the physical infidelity because it had made her doubt her own perceptions and had prevented her from trusting her instincts about what was happening in her marriage and in Richard's professional life. Wednesday afternoon, I received a text message from Lydia reminding me that she would be leaving early Thursday morning for her trip and asking if I needed anything from the store before she departed, and I replied with a casual message saying that I thought we had everything we needed and wishing her a productive conference and safe travels.
The exchange felt surreal because I was maintaining the pretense of being a supportive spouse who accepted her cover story at face value, while simultaneously building a comprehensive evidence file that would be used to expose her deception in front of 200 donors and hospital board members at the charity gala in less than 2 weeks. And I wondered if Lydia felt any similar sense of disconnection or cognitive dissonance as she prepared to travel with her lover while texting her husband about grocery shopping and household logistics. That evening, I met Diana again at the same coffee shop where we had first discussed our collaborative strategy, and she brought with her a portfolio of materials she had been preparing for the charity gala presentation, including draft slides about the foundation's commitment to ethical vendor relationships and transparent procurement practices. Diana had also prepared a supplementary handout that would be distributed to gala attendees during the presentation, and the handout included a timeline showing the dates of contract approvals alongside the dates of evening meetings and weekend planning sessions that Lydia had attended, and the visual representation of the overlapping patterns made it very clear that there had been extensive coordination between Richard and Lydia around both professional activities and personal interactions that had not been disclosed to supervisors or to the compliance oversight mechanisms that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of conflict of interest from developing or going undetected. I suggested to Diana that we should also include in the handout a brief summary of the hospital's conflict of interest policy with the relevant sections highlighted so that audience members would be able to see immediately that the behavior being documented was not just ethically questionable, but was also a clear violation of written policies that all hospital personnel were required to acknowledge and comply with as a condition of their employment. Diana agreed with this suggestion and added the policy summary to her draft handout, and then she asked me if I had given any thought to how we would handle the actual moment of revelation during the gala when it would become clear to Lydia and Richard and everyone else in the room that their affair and their professional misconduct were being publicly exposed in front of the donor community and the hospital leadership. I told Diana that I thought the most effective approach would be for her to present the evidence as chair of the gala and as the senior staff member responsible for maintaining the foundation's reputation and ethical standards, and that my role should be limited to being present in the audience as a concerned community member rather than appearing on stage or speaking publicly about my personal stake in the situation, because I thought the revelation would carry more institutional weight and would seem less like personal revenge if it came from Diana in her official capacity rather than from me as a betrayed spouse seeking vindication or punishment. Diana said that she appreciated my willingness to remain in the background during the actual presentation, even though I had contributed substantially to gathering and organizing the evidence, and she said that she thought my approach was strategically sound because it would make it much harder for Richard or his attorneys to characterize the exposure as a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate institutional response to documented policy violations and conflicts of interest that threatened the foundation's credibility with donors and regulatory oversight bodies. She added that she planned to coordinate with the hospital's board chair, Dr. Simon Vance, before the gala to give him advance notice that the presentation would include sensitive personnel information and that there might need to be an immediate executive session following the gala to discuss appropriate disciplinary responses and policy reforms to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. I asked Diana if she was concerned that giving advance notice to I spent Thursday morning monitoring our shared credit card account for any new charges that would confirm Lydia's arrival at the coastal resort, and around noon I saw a charge appear her valet parking at the resort property, followed shortly by a charge for lunch at the resort's beachfront restaurant. And the amounts and the timing suggested that Lydia and presumably Richard had arrived at their destination and were settling in for their 3-day stay at the luxury property that we were partially funding through the misuse of our shared financial resources. I screenshot the valet parking charge and the restaurant charge and sent both images to Diana along with a message noting that the timestamps indicated Lydia had arrived at the resort around 11:30 in the morning, which meant she had probably taken the same flight that Richard had booked since the timing aligned perfectly with a departure from our city's airport on an early morning flight that would have landed at the coastal destination with enough time for ground transportation to the resort and check-in procedures before lunch. Diana confirmed that she had also seen charges on Richard's credit card for the same valet parking service and for what appeared to be drinks at the resort bar, and she said that the matching location data and overlapping timestamps provided clear documentation that Richard and Lydia were together at the resort rather than attending separate conferences in different cities as they had told their respective spouses.
Diana said that Jennifer's resignation had come very suddenly with only 2 weeks' notice and no clear explanation beyond a vague statement about pursuing other opportunities, and that Jennifer had declined an exit interview and had not maintained contact with former colleagues after her departure, despite having been well-liked and socially integrated within the foundation's staff culture. The pattern that Diana described sounded very similar to what might happen if someone had been involved in an inappropriate relationship with a supervisor or senior colleague and had chosen to leave the organization rather than risk exposure or continuing to work in a situation that had become untenable or uncomfortable. And I told Diana that if she thought Jennifer might be willing to talk about her experience and to provide information that would help establish Richard's history of targeting vulnerable staff members, then it was worth making contact even though there was some risk involved in expanding our investigation beyond the current situation with Lydia. Diana said that she would send Jennifer a carefully worded message through a professional networking platform asking if they could meet for coffee to discuss some confidential matters related to Jennifer's time at the foundation, and that she would emphasize in her message that the conversation would be entirely voluntary and that Jennifer should feel no pressure to participate if she was uncomfortable discussing her reasons for leaving or her experiences working with Richard.
Friday morning, Diana sent me a screenshot of the message she had sent to Jennifer Ashford, and I thought the wording struck an appropriate balance between indicating that the topic was serious and potentially sensitive, while also respecting Jennifer's autonomy and right to decline the meeting if she preferred not to revisit what might have been a painful or complicated period in her professional life. Diana said that Jennifer had not yet responded to the message and that it might take several days for her to see it or to decide whether she wanted to engage with Diana's request, and that in the meantime, we should continue monitoring Richard and Lydia's expenses and activities at the resort and finalizing the presentation materials for the charity gala. I spent Friday working on a detailed timeline document that organized all of the evidence Diana and I had gathered into a chronological narrative that showed the progression of Richard and Lydia's relationship from their initial professional interactions through the pattern of vendor contract approvals and evening meetings and weekend planning sessions, and finally to the current trip where they were staying together at a luxury coastal resort while telling their spouses that they were attending separate business conferences in different inland cities.
The timeline included dates and supporting documentation for each major event or interaction, and I formatted the document so that it could be easily incorporated into Diana's gala presentation or distributed as a handout that would allow audience members to see at a glance how long the relationship had been ongoing and how carefully Richard and Lydia had coordinated their deception and their exploitation of their respective organizational roles to facilitate and conceal their involvement. Diana reviewed the timeline document and said that it was exactly what she needed to support the presentation she was preparing. And she asked if I would be willing to work with her photographer colleague Rachel Quinn to create some visual displays that would make the timeline and the vendor contract information more accessible and impactful for an audience that would be seeing this evidence for the first time during the gala event. I agreed to coordinate with Rachel, and Diana sent me Rachel's contact information, along with a brief explanation that Rachel specialized in creating evidence displays for nonprofit accountability presentations and legal proceedings where complex financial or organizational information needed to be communicated clearly to audiences without specialized expertise in reading contracts or analyzing institutional data. I called Rachel Friday afternoon and explained that I needed help creating visual materials that would document a conflict of interest situation involving hospital foundation personnel. And Rachel said that she had worked with Diana on several previous projects and understood the importance of presenting evidence in ways that were factual and comprehensive without appearing sensationalized or emotionally manipulative. I added that the staged photograph would also create a symmetry and a poetic justice to the situation that would make the eventual gala revelation more satisfying and more memorable, because Richard and Lydia would have experienced the shock and the betrayal of believing that their spouses had turned to each other for comfort or revenge, and then at the gala, they would discover that the photograph had been a tactical maneuver designed to destabilize them rather than evidence of an actual affair between Diana and me. Diana considered my proposal and said that she understood the strategic appeal of forcing Richard and Lydia into a reactive posture rather than allowing them to complete their trip according to their own timeline and their own sense of control over the situation, but that she was concerned about the ethical implications of creating a false photograph and using it to manipulate people's emotions, even if those people were themselves guilty of extensive deception and manipulation in their affair and their exploitation of their professional positions. I told Diana that I appreciated her ethical concerns and that I did not take lightly the decision to use deceptive tactics even against people who had deceived us, but that I thought there was a meaningful difference between creating a strategic pressure point that would force Richard and Lydia to reveal themselves more fully and the kind of systematic, long-term deception that they had practiced against us over many months while conducting their affair and coordinating their vendor contracts and constructing their cover stories. Diana said that she would agree to participate in creating the staged photograph if we could establish some clear boundaries around how the image would be used and what we would say to Richard and Lydia when they inevitably confronted us about the photograph, and demanded to know whether Diana and I were actually involved in a romantic relationship or whether the image had been fabricated purely to manipulate them into returning home early. I suggested that when Richard and Lydia confronted us, we should simply say that the photograph represented the beginning of a new alliance between two people who had been betrayed by their spouses and who had found common cause in holding Richard and Lydia accountable for their deception and their professional misconduct, and that whether the alliance was purely strategic or whether it had any personal or romantic dimension was none of their concern, given that they had forfeited any right to information about our lives or our relationships when they chose to conduct their affair and to lie to us repeatedly about their activities and their feelings. Diana agreed with this approach and said that she would contact her photographer colleague Rachel Quinn to see if Rachel would be willing to help us create the staged photograph in a way that would look authentic and intimate, but would not require Diana and me to actually engage in any behavior that would feel uncomfortable or inappropriate, given that we barely knew each other beyond the crisis situation that had brought us together as tactical allies. Diana suggested that we should send the image on Sunday evening, while Richard and Lydia were presumably having dinner or enjoying their last night at the resort before their planned Monday morning departure, because the timing would force them to spend their final night at the resort dealing with the emotional fallout and the logistical complications of deciding whether to return home immediately or to proceed with their original travel schedule while knowing that their spouses had discovered the affair and had apparently responded by becoming involved with each other. I agreed with Diana's timing recommendation, and we decided that I would send the photograph to Lydia via text message with a brief caption that simply said, "Caught you too, come home," and that Diana would send the same photograph to Richard with an identical caption so that both of them would receive the image at essentially the same moment and would not have time to coordinate their responses or to develop a unified strategy for managing the situation before they had each reacted individually to the shock and the accusation embedded in the photograph and the caption. At 7:30 on Sunday evening, I sent the photograph to Lydia's cell phone and watched as the message status changed from sent to delivered to read within the span of about 2 minutes. And then I waited to see how long it would take for Lydia to respond and what form her response would take, given that she would need to process the implications of the image and decide whether to acknowledge her affair immediately or to attempt some kind of explanation or denial that would preserve at least some version of her cover story. My phone remained silent for almost 10 minutes, and I began to wonder whether Lydia had decided not to respond at all, or whether she was showing the photograph to Richard and they were together formulating a response strategy that would minimize their vulnerability or maintain some degree of deniability about the nature of their relationship and their reasons for traveling together.
Then my phone suddenly exploded with incoming messages and calls as Lydia apparently abandoned any pretense of calm or strategic thinking and began sending a rapid series of texts demanding to know where I had gotten the photograph and whether I was actually involved with Diana or whether the image was some kind of manipulation or trick designed to make Lydia confess to something that she could still potentially deny or explain away as a misunderstanding. I did not respond to any of Lydia's messages or answer any of her calls because I wanted to maintain the pressure and the uncertainty that the photograph had created, and I knew that my silence would be more destabilizing and more effective at forcing Lydia into a reactive defensive posture than any explanation or accusation I could offer through text message or phone conversation. Diana sent me a screenshot of similar messages she was receiving from Richard, and his texts showed the same pattern of panic and confusion and desperate attempts to understand what Diana knew and how she had obtained the photograph, and whether Diana and I were actually together, or whether we had simply staged the image to manipulate Richard and Lydia into returning home early.
Diana also chose not to respond to Richard's messages, and we agreed that we would maintain our silence until Richard and Lydia actually returned to the city and attempted to confront us in person, at which point we would be able to control the setting and the terms of the conversation, rather than being drawn into a long-distance argument through text messages that would give Richard and Lydia time to refine their cover stories and coordinate their defensive strategies. About 30 minutes after I sent the photograph to Lydia, I received a phone call from an unknown number that I suspected was Richard calling from his cell phone in an attempt to reach me directly, rather than continuing to communicate through Lydia, who was apparently not getting any responses to her increasingly frantic messages. I let the call go to voicemail and then listened to the message Richard left, and his voice had the controlled but strained quality of someone who was trying to sound reasonable and calm while actually experiencing significant emotional distress and strategic confusion about how to manage a situation that had suddenly moved beyond his control or his ability to shape through the manipulation tactics that he had apparently used successfully in previous affairs or conflicts. I read through the messages quickly without responding to any of them, and I noted that nowhere in her lengthy overnight communication did Lydia actually deny that she was having an affair with Richard, or attempt to provide an alternative explanation for why she was at a coastal resort with him while telling me that she was attending a vendor conference with Diana in an inland city several hours away in a completely different direction. Diana called me around 8 o'clock Monday morning to report that she had just met with Jennifer Ashford at a coffee shop near the Hospital Foundation offices, and that Jennifer had confirmed Diana's suspicion that Richard had pursued an inappropriate relationship with Jennifer during her time working in the donor relations office about 14 months earlier. Diana told me that Jennifer had been reluctant at first to provide specific details about her relationship with Richard because she felt ashamed about having been involved with a married man and guilty about not having warned anyone at the foundation before she left. But that once Diana explained that Richard was currently involved in a similar situation with another staff member, and that Diana was trying to document a pattern of predatory behavior in order to protect future potential victims, Jennifer had become more willing to share her story and to provide names and dates and specific examples of how Richard had initiated and maintained the relationship while using his institutional authority and his control over procurement decisions to create leverage and dependence. Jennifer explained that Richard had initially approached her under the pretense of wanting to better understand donor priorities and cultivation strategies so that he could align vendor relationships with fundraising goals, and that these initial professional conversations had gradually evolved into personal discussions about Jennifer's career aspirations and her frustrations with certain aspects of foundation culture and management, and that Richard had positioned himself as a mentor and advocate who could help Jennifer advance within the organization and who understood her talents and potential in ways that her direct supervisors apparently did not. The pattern that Jennifer described was almost identical to what I had observed in the vendor contracts and coordination between Richard and Lydia, where professional collaboration and legitimate organizational business had been used as cover for developing personal relationships that served Richard's interests while creating vulnerability and dependence for the women he targeted through his attention and his promises of support and advocacy.
Jennifer said that the relationship had become physical after about 3 months of increasingly personal conversations and after-hours meetings that Richard had characterized as necessary for certain donor cultivation projects that required confidential planning and strategy development outside of normal office hours and away from other staff members who might not understand the sophisticated approaches that Richard and Jennifer were supposedly developing together.
Diana asked Jennifer why she had decided to leave the foundation rather than reporting Richard's behavior to human resources or to senior leadership, who might have been able to intervene or at least document the situation for future reference. And Jennifer said that Richard had been very skilled at making her feel that she was an equal participant in the relationship, rather than someone being manipulated or exploited by a supervisor with institutional power. And that by the time Jennifer realized that Richard had been pursuing similar relationships with other women and that his interest in her was not unique or special, she felt too compromised and too implicated in the deception to come forward without destroying her own reputation and career prospects within the nonprofit healthcare sector, where everyone knew everyone and where stories about inappropriate relationships would follow her to any future position she might seek. Jennifer also told Diana that Richard had made subtle but clear threats about what might happen if Jennifer attempted to expose the relationship or to cause problems for him within the foundation, and that these threats had involved references to Jennifer's performance reviews and her professional reputation and her future employment prospects, and that Richard had framed these threats as friendly advice from someone who cared about Jennifer's well-being rather than as explicit intimidation, but that the message had been unmistakable that Jennifer would suffer significant professional and personal consequences if she chose to challenge Richard or to reveal what had happened between them during her time at the foundation.
Diana said that she thought we should focus the gala presentation primarily on the documented evidence of Richard and Lydia's relationship and the vendor contract's conflicts of interest, and that we should mention the existence of prior concerns about Richard's conduct without providing specific names or details that would expose Jennifer or other potential victims to unwanted attention or scrutiny from the donor audience, who would be primarily interested in understanding the current situation and the institutional failures that had allowed it to develop, rather than hearing about historical cases that might distract from the immediate accountability questions. I agreed with Diana's approach and suggested that we should prepare a separate confidential briefing document for Dr. Vance and the hospital board members that would include Jennifer's testimony and any other information about Richard's pattern of behavior, and that this document could be provided to appropriate decision makers after the gala presentation had established the baseline facts about the current situation and had created institutional momentum for a more comprehensive investigation into Richard's conduct over his entire tenure with the hospital foundation. Monday afternoon, I finally received the message I had been expecting, which was a text from Lydia saying that she and Richard were cutting their trip short and would be returning to the city that evening instead of Tuesday morning as originally planned, and that she needed to talk to me immediately about the photograph I had sent and about what was happening between Diana and me, and about whether I had been spying on Lydia or investigating her activities in ways that violated her privacy and her trust.
I did not respond to Lydia's message, but I forwarded it to Diana along with a note saying that our strategy of sending the staged photograph had achieved exactly the result we had intended, which was to force Richard and Lydia to abandon their romantic getaway and return home in a state of panic and defensive confusion that would make them more vulnerable when we eventually confronted them with the full scope of evidence we had compiled about their affair and their professional misconduct. Diana replied to my message saying that she had received a similar text from Richard announcing his early return and demanding an immediate conversation about the photograph and about Diana's relationship with me. And Diana said that she thought we should arrange to meet Richard and Lydia together rather than having separate conversations with our respective spouses, because a joint confrontation would prevent them from coordinating their stories or supporting each other's denial strategies, and would also allow Diana and me to present our evidence as a unified front rather than as two separate betrayed spouses pursuing independent grievances.
I agreed with Diana's suggestion and proposed that we should stage the confrontation at my house where we had taken the photograph, because returning Richard and Lydia to the location where the image had been created would add another layer of psychological pressure and would reinforce the sense that Diana and I had been working together strategically rather than simply discovering our spouse's affair independently and reacting with spontaneous emotional distress.
Rachel arrived at my house around 5 o'clock and set up her camera equipment in a position where she could record the confrontation without being obtrusive or creating a theatrical atmosphere that might make Richard and Lydia feel that they were being trapped or humiliated rather than simply being held accountable through documentation and direct questions about behavior that they had chosen to engage in despite their professional responsibilities and their marital commitments. Diana arrived shortly after Rachel, and we spent a few minutes reviewing our strategy for the confrontation and agreeing that Diana would take the lead in presenting evidence and asking questions, since her position as a hospital foundation director and her role as Richard's spouse gave her institutional authority and personal standing that I lacked as an outsider to the organization whose only connection to the situation was through my marriage to Lydia. Lydia and Richard arrived at my house around 6:30, and I could see through the front window that they had driven separately rather than arriving together, which suggested that they were already feeling defensive and were trying to maintain at least a superficial appearance of not being coordinated or allied in their response to whatever confrontation they expected to face when they walked through my door and saw Diana and me waiting together in the living room where we had staged the photograph that had forced them to cut short their romantic getaway and return home to deal with spouses who were no longer willing to accept cover stories or vague explanations about professional obligations and work-related travel.
I opened the door before Lydia could knock, and I saw her face register shock and confusion when she looked past me and saw Diana sitting on the sofa in the exact spot where we had posed for the photograph. And I saw Richard standing behind Lydia on the front step, with an expression that combined anger and calculation as he tried to assess the situation and determine what approach would be most effective in minimizing his exposure and maintaining his position, both within his marriage and within the hospital foundation, where his authority and reputation were sources of power that he clearly did not want to surrender or see diminished by revelations about his personal conduct. I stepped aside without speaking and gestured for Lydia and Richard to enter the house, and they walked into the living room and remained standing near the doorway rather than sitting down or moving further into the space. And I could see that they were both trying to project confidence and control despite the obvious fact that they had been caught in a lie and were now facing spouses who had somehow discovered their affair and had apparently formed an alliance that neither Lydia nor Richard had anticipated or prepared for in their planning around cover stories and risk management. I let Lydia finish her defensive speech without interrupting because I wanted Rachel's camera to capture the full extent of Lydia's attempt to reframe the situation as something I had caused through neglect or inadequacy, rather than something she had chosen to pursue through deliberate deception and calculated exploitation of her professional role and her access to Richard's procurement authority. Richard took a different approach and tried to position himself as a reasonable person who was willing to discuss the situation calmly and to address whatever concerns Diana and I had about his professional conduct. And he said that while he acknowledged that his relationship with Lydia had crossed certain boundaries that should have been maintained between colleagues in their respective organizational positions, he did not believe that there had been any actual conflict of interest or policy violation, because the vendor contracts he had approved for Lydia's department had all been legitimate business arrangements that served real organizational needs and had been reviewed through proper channels, including compliance oversight that Lydia herself had participated in as part of her professional responsibilities. Diana responded to Richard's attempt at reasonable deflection by pulling out her laptop and opening a presentation that showed side-by-side comparisons of the dates when Richard had approved vendor contracts benefiting Lydia's programs and the dates when Lydia had marked evening meetings or weekend planning sessions on her calendar that we now knew had been cover stories for personal meetings with Richard rather than actual work activities involving other staff members or legitimate organizational business. The visual presentation of the timeline and the contract approvals had an immediate effect on Richard's demeanor, and he stopped trying to sound reasonable and instead became angry and accusatory, demanding to know how Diana had obtained access to internal hospital foundation records. and whether she had violated confidentiality policies or exceeded her authority as media relations director by reviewing procurement files and personnel calendars that were not within her normal scope of responsibility. Diana remained calm and explained that all of the information she had compiled was either publicly available through the Foundation's transparency database or was accessible to her through her legitimate administrative privileges as a senior staff member, and that she had every right as both a Foundation director and as Richard's spouse to review information that was relevant to understanding whether her husband had been conducting himself ethically and appropriately in his professional role and in his personal relationships with subordinate staff members. I added that I had obtained the credit card records and the travel information through my access to joint financial accounts that Lydia and I shared as married partners, and that I had every legal and ethical right to monitor how our shared resources were being used and to question expenses that appeared to be funding personal travel and romantic activities rather than legitimate household needs or agreed-upon expenditures that we had discussed and approved together as part of our normal financial planning and marriage partnership. Diana sat back down on the sofa, and I remained standing near the window where I could watch both Lydia and Richard and observe their reactions as Diana began systematically walking through the evidence we had compiled and asking specific questions about dates and meetings and contract approvals and conversations that Richard and Lydia had clearly believed would remain private and undiscoverable, but that Diana and I had documented through patient investigation and strategic coordination over the past week, while Richard and Lydia had been enjoying their resort getaway and congratulating themselves on having successfully deceived their spouses once again. Diana asked Richard directly how long his relationship with Lydia had been ongoing and whether it had begun before or after he had approved the first vendor contract that benefited Lydia's compliance office. And Richard hesitated before answering because he clearly understood that his response would either establish a timeline of professional misconduct that preceded the affair or would suggest that the affair had developed first and had then been leveraged for professional advantage through the vendor contract approvals. Richard finally said that he and Lydia had begun working closely together within a few months of his arrival at the hospital foundation, and that their professional collaboration had gradually evolved into a personal friendship and eventually into a romantic relationship. But he insisted that the vendor contracts he had approved were legitimate business arrangements that would have been approved regardless of his personal feelings for Lydia, because the services were needed and the vendors were qualified and the pricing was competitive with market rates for similar services. Richard's unexpected admission that Lydia was not his first affair within the Foundation created a moment of silence in the room as everyone processed the implications of what he had just revealed, and I watched Lydia's face register shock and hurt as she apparently realized for the first time that she had not been special or unique in Richard's eyes, but rather had been simply the most recent in a series of women he had targeted and manipulated through his institutional authority and his calculated attention to their professional aspirations and personal vulnerabilities. Diana seized on Richard's admission and asked him directly how many other women he had been involved with during his time at the Foundation, and whether any of those relationships had also involved vendor contracts or procurement decisions that benefited the programs or departments where these women worked. And Richard said that he could think of at least 2 other situations where personal relationships had developed alongside professional collaborations, but that he did not want to provide specific names or details without consulting with an attorney about what he was legally required to disclose and what might constitute defamation or privacy violations if he spoke publicly about relationships that the other women involved might prefer to keep confidential.